Welcome to Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. It is understood that professional sports as we know them must allow players to be moved. To enjoy the privilege of a life playing a game at the highest level, one must accept some period of your career where you can be reduced to an asset that slides from one balance sheet to another. We know this impersonal framing does not fit when the other side of the trade ends in the hoisting of a trophy or a contract extension that could buy a small island. But that is the rare final outcome. Ignoring the human impact can prevent us from understanding that those close to these players may also be moving children, not just luxury vehicles. In this episode, we will discuss the culture of the trade in sports to understand its full impact beyond a player's performance and stat sheet. We will discuss this with longtime Major League outfielder Preston Wilson, a legacy big leaguer whose 10-year career had its share of trades to and from opportunity. We also will hear from Lawrence Frank, the head of basketball operations for the Los Angeles Clippers, who also engaged in this experience as both coach and head coach of a number of NBA teams. The trade. Exciting in our fantasy rosters, but what is it really like for those on the ground? Let's get to class and find out. It has been said that one man's trash is another man's treasure, but tell that to the man traded away in the middle of a season. It is hard not to focus on the rejection, especially since in most cases, athletes had no say in this transaction. It is the clearest moment to remind you that despite your exploding slider, 2 kids in preschool, and off-season charity work, you are a commodity, an asset that is both transferable and fungible. I was traded twice in my major league career, once in the off-season and once in the middle of a season. Both times, despite it leading to an opportunity to be a starter, or even moving me from a last-place team to a contender, I still felt like I had lost something significant. A trade in sports is simply part of the playbook when any front office needs to add or subtract talent. The athletes involved have been reduced to data, reinterpreted in a way to assess their past, present, and future, so that time stands still and apples can be compared to apples. The future can now be traded for the present and even sometimes the past. Only time will then allow us to know who got the better of the deal. Yet behind those numbers against left-handed hitting or 3-point shooting percentage in the fourth quarter are people whose lives and family lives will be turned upside down in the middle of the night. A broken lease, a new school to find, a goodbye to a neighbor. Making matters worse is that the new city may contain less of a future beyond the year of the trade, or even a smaller role to play than from where you were traded. In 2003, I left Texas as a starting everyday center fielder for the Texas Rangers. I arrived in Chicago as the periodic platoon 4th outfielder against lefties. Meanwhile, another game is coming at you as you pack and unpack your life to get settled again. Despite a familiarity with a life full of address changes, it is not just your life, it is a change for those in your inner circle. Moments after Texas traded me mid-season, I went to the locker room to say goodbye and to pack up my things. My bags were already packed. It was as if I was packed in that box too. The next day, I would be in another uniform in a new city in a new lineup. That trade to Chicago led to my only playoff appearance in my big league career, but the discomfort of rejection still flares up occasionally. Maybe it was a wash in the end, or even a good outcome to at least have reached Game 7 of the NLCS. Or maybe this is simply a reflection of life itself, and that some change is out of our control. Very thrilled for our next guest joining Classes in Session. We have Preston Wilson, 10 years in the big leagues and spent numerous years in sports media in his post-career and currently working with Perfect Game. So Preston Wilson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, man. Anytime we hook up, it's always a pleasure and always something good comes out of it.
Absolutely, man. Well, you're sort of the professor today, and today we're talking about the trade. And we just passed the trade deadline in baseball about a month ago, a little over earlier this month, I should say. And you've been a player that has been traded multiple times throughout your career. So give us a sense of your takeaways about that experience. And I'm sure each one was different. So, what did you find changed each time?
Well, the first thing I realized was how different it is from anything else as far as the workforce in the world. In sports, you have a situation where you're basically a piece, a commodity. So you can basically just be moved to a whole nother town in exchange for other goods or commodities. So for me, the first thing was when I was with the Mets and I got traded from the Mets to the Marlins, I had been with the Mets my whole career. Now all of a sudden, everything is different. I'm going over to a team that I used to try to beat every day. And honestly, when I got traded from the Mets to the Marlins were in town playing us. So I actually just switched dugouts and ended up playing against my former team the very next night. It's a very surreal experience. And you realize that everything is just uprooted and everything comes so fast because now you're not just switching uniforms, but you're switching zip codes, you're switching houses, everything is changing.
Well, and speaking of, so as those trades move on, you mentioned the first time after a long established career with the Mets. I mean, what about as you got to be a veteran? Did you see it differently?
Oh, yeah. Number one, you have more stuff. You know, your life has accumulated more things, whether it be just things as far as clothes and houses or whatever. You also have more people in your lives. You know, when I got traded the second time, I was engaged. So I had someone that I was very close with, a significant other, and now we got to start changing how we're going to think about planning this life we're planning together. Potential schools, when kids come into the picture, there's a whole lot of things that came in when you didn't have to consider before. Well, I didn't have to consider before when I was younger.
Did you find, first of all, having prior knowledge, did it exist? And if it did it help you actually deal with the transition of maybe knowing a little bit in advance that this might happen?
I can honestly say each time it came as quite a surprise to me, Doug. It really did. I had no idea I was getting traded any of those times. But what it was like was, okay, now you got to get everybody into the mix. I got to get my agent into the mix to know what I'm doing, where I'm going, you know, trying to figure out all of these logistics on the fly while still trying to compete, because you don't get a week off or 2 weeks off. You got to go report to that ball club that night or the next day, and you have to play and try to compete while having your whole life just uprooted.
And so there's a moment, I go back to, I was traded from Texas to Chicago 2003. And the shock for me is I remember, you know, getting the call and the next day, all right, let me get my stuff out of the locker room. And I walked in the locker room and my stuff was all boxed up and packed away. Like I was gone. So I was wondering your experience on, I guess, that moment of leaving. And then also on the other side, what was the arrival like? You know, those sort of bookends of that experience.
I came in and with the Marlins from the Mets, had to prove myself there because I wasn't one of their homegrown guys. Finally proved myself, won the starting job, kind of earned my place in the organization. And then 4 years later, I found out I get traded, and it's to Colorado. Colorado has a history of all these, you know, famous players, Dante Bichette, Todd Helton, Larry Walker. So now it's me leaving a place where I kind of made myself at home in the major leagues to a team that has itself already set up, running with its own history, with its own players, with its own clubhouse leaders. So now I'm going into a situation trying to figure out, how do I fit in? How do I behave? Am I going to be held in the same regard in Colorado as I was in Florida? You don't know. Obviously, someone wants you in the trade, or at least hopefully you're the one that wanted in the trade. It's kind of like the new kid going to a new high school, and you don't know where you're going to fit in or how you're going to be accepted.
We continue with Preston Wilson on the toll trades can take on a player. Plus, LA Clippers president Lawrence Frank shares how management balances a team's needs with a player's needs when they make a transaction. Next on Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. When they say pack your bags in the big leagues, they really mean it. Actually, my odyssey across North America began before I ever even reached the majors. After getting drafted by the Cubs, I settled in Geneva, New York for a season. Then, off to what became an annual stay in Mesa, Arizona for spring training. The next season, Winston-Salem, North Carolina for high A-ball. And back to Mesa, Arizona for spring training. Then came the Florida swing with stops in Daytona Beach, followed by Orlando. Back to Mesa, Arizona for the Arizona Fall League. Next was Mayagüez, Puerto Rico for winter ball, before my AAA stop in Des Moines, Iowa to play for the Iowa Cubs. Finally, after all that hard work, a trip to Chicago and a chance to play with the Cubbies for the first time. I had made it. A year later, I was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies. I stayed put for 5 years with the Phillies, and every spring training was in beautiful Clearwater, Florida. Well, you can't stay still forever. Free agency took me to Arlington, Texas to play with the Texas Rangers and spring training in Surprise, Arizona. Texas didn't last long. I got traded mid-season to the Chicago Cubs. The offseason took me back to Philadelphia and another tour of beautiful Clearwater, Florida. Ironically, my journey ended in Clearwater, Florida in a game against the Phillies as a member of the New York Yankees after 14 years of pro ball. So what about the relocation side of this, right? You talked about a little bit earlier about apartments and all that. I mean, so what kind of chaos does that unleash?
Oh my goodness. So I had my truck shipped from Colorado to DC. I had basically, I had my house throughout the whole year. And at the end of the season, they basically boxed up my whole condo and moved that to my house down in Florida. So so now I got storage units full of stuff in Florida that I have to sift through. When in DC, I just did like corporate housing because I didn't even want to set up another apartment, but I still had a whole condo, like a 3-bedroom condo full of stuff, furniture, everything, clothes, to decide what I needed to do with it. So had to eventually have that shipped back to Florida. Yeah, it's just making me break out in a sweat just thinking about it again.
Yeah. When you look at our, today now, there's so much around fantasy sports. There's so much around, everybody's like a mini GM, right? They all make these moves. And you also just see what happens in whether a Juan Soto or players get traded. So what would you tell, sort of an audience of fantasy baseball players, let's say, who can make moves with a click of a button? What would you do to summarize, I guess, what it means to be traded?
That's a human life. Yes, it's a sport. Yes, it is a position on the ballpark, but that is a human life, and that human life has other people and things attached to it. So when you really think about that, you're making the decision to have someone change cities, not just change teams, you're impacting more than just that player. And there's a whole lot of things that are tangentially attached to that player that need to be accounted for. And if you don't think about that, then I think there's a little bit of loss of humanity in that thought process.
Yeah. Well, Preston, I really appreciate you joining us on Classes in Session. Those insights are so valuable because you're taking us, right in the field, right in the locker room, right in your house at different times.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Doug.
Well, this is a pleasant surprise, joined by a good friend and special guest Lawrence Frank, who is the president of basketball operations for the Los Angeles Clippers, and full disclosure, a Little League teammate of mine back in Teaneck, New Jersey, back in the day. And of course, he also coached the New Jersey Nets, which I was a fan of growing up. So that was very cool. So Lawrence Frank, thank you so much for joining us on Classes in Session.
Well, I appreciate it. And this is the least I can do is share some time for a guy who carried me all through Little League and gave me the great pleasure of being on the winning side. So thank you.
Well, Lawrence, we're loving doing the show. And one thing we get into is some of the connections that sports makes with larger society, the questions that we all have as fans and friends and audiences and players. And so today we're talking about trades. And in your position with basketball operations, I just want to start at the basics, like how do even trades materialize when you think about making these kinds of moves?
Yeah, look, one of our jobs is to be in constant communication with the rest of the league. And the way it works, the dialogue, you're always sharing information with the other teams in terms of what your needs are, players of interest that you like on their team. They exchange that same information. And as you go throughout the year, the number one thing you have to be an expert on is your own team. You really have to do a great job of self-evaluation and knowing kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each player, knowing how they fit within the bigger picture, knowing how everything fits within your long-term strategic plan of what is your ultimate goal? Now, some organizations, the goal is just to make the playoffs and be a consistent playoff contender. For our goal is to win a championship. So every step we take and every decision we make, it has to fall in line with that. And you're always looking at every deal. It's not about winning a deal. It's about finding how does each team benefit from whatever said transaction is.
That's an interesting point to consider because you think about, I made this trade and I won this trade, But because of the interpersonal relationships with all these teams, you want to be able to be able to eat the Thanksgiving turkey together, so to speak. How do you build those relationships to be able to get to the point of trust with literally all these organizations?
Yeah, I think you have to establish, and it's through your actions and your behaviors, trust and credibility. And as you know, in any relationship, trust is really, really hard to first achieve and then also to maintain. It's not like you just get a blank check on trust. You're constantly earning people's trust every single day. No different than with teams. And I think what we've done, and we take pride in it, is that the trades we've made have worked out for both teams, and everything stays out of the, as much as controlled off the internet, because we do understand the hardest and worst part of the job is a trade because of the impact on the player, their families, on your team, on your organization, on your fans. And everyone has that same goal, right? That no one wants for their player to find out about a potential trade on the internet.
Coming up, Lawrence Frank on finding the right home for a player in a trade. We'll be right back on Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, as we continue with Lawrence Frank. Now, so take me through the player perspective that you found. For one, you were a head coach for a long time, so you understand it in a different kind of way before you've had this position. The player, surely self-centered in a sense because that's your job. How do you talk to them through the fact that there are all of these layers?
Yeah, great question. I think the intent is to try to do it with as much transparency as possible without setting off fire alarms when fire alarms don't need to be set off, so to speak. So once you think that there's, like legit traction, typically what you try to do, and we haven't been able to do it every time, but we've been able to do it most of the time. You let the agent know, hey, look, we are having conversations about your client. Okay. So it's better to do things with candor. Okay. Now there are certain situations where we haven't been able to do it, but most situations we have. Then I sit down with the player and just face to face, and without trying to increase their anxiety, at least let them know, hey, look, okay, we're having serious conversations with you. You would be part of this deal. I want you to hear everything from us first. I know there's a lot going through your head, but at least I don't want you to be caught off guard. And even though these are hard and uncomfortable conversations, at least want you to know what's going on. Imagine if I'm having that conversation with you, all the different things that are going through your head, because as soon as I have that conversation, in your mind, you're going, okay, L's trading me. It's not that it could be traded. No. He's trading me. So you're going back home, you're talking to your wife, what are we going to do with the kids? What about the school? Where possibly could I go? It's not a science. It's an art, a little bit of understanding, just a mutual respect of we're sharing this, but I need you to kind of keep it quiet.
Now, talk to me about the players that are coming in. You always think about, okay, I'm trading this guy out, but there's the scenario that you're getting something in return. Do you have structures around where, for lack of better term, welcoming committee, relocation services? Yeah,
without a doubt. I think, look, you have a very detailed protocol step by step of how you want to execute. So we have a point person who's basically air traffic control that gives an overview of kind of, all right, hey, because it could be the player's first time they've been traded. It could be their fourth time that gets traded. We always treat it as a new experience and take it step by step. We want to make that onboarding process a great introduction to what the Clipper experience is going to be for that player.
So what was the learning curve like in getting to this point, right? I mean, you're coming from being a head coach and other transitions, and you have great mastery now of like all these moving parts. But, what were the bumps in the road in learning this job?
I was in the job too long, and we traded our franchise player, Blake Griffin, and ultimately with that decision, we know our North Star is to be a sustainable championship contender. We didn't feel after evaluating the team that we could get there, right? And Blake is trading him just emotionally was such a difficult decision, yet one we felt we needed to do. If I had a do-over, I would have communicated with Blake, with his agent, right? In the process, we discussed it internally, and we decided that in order to do what's best for the organization, we had to keep things extremely tight-lipped. If there was a do-over, I would have done things differently. And so then with each future transaction, you try to apply those lessons. But I think virtually with every other transaction, we've been so transparent. Pat Beverly, love Pat Beverly, still talk to him. And it was a very transparent conversation about an extension, and we just couldn't come to an agreement on it. So we worked together and we found a trade. So there's an understanding of why we did it, and you're not catching people you care about off guard.
Well, Lawrence, I really appreciate you taking so much time today. And it's, for starters, great to see an old friend. We can go back, including our championship with the Jets back in Little League days. But wishing you continued success.
Well, I appreciate having me on, and you know how much we love and respect all the great work that you're doing. It's you bring great pride to the city of Teaneck, man, and we love you.
In the fantasy of a life in pro sports, trades come with the territory. New teammates come, new teammates go, and it's likely that one day you will be the new kid in the classroom. The same feeling a player feels when blindsided by a trade and scrambling to pack that suitcase before the game the next day. Even if the trade works out well for you as a player, that you finally become a starter, that you make the postseason with your new team, it will still be hard to let go of what was once home, especially when that home was your very first organization in your professional career. Yet a trade is a tool for a team to get better through addition by addition, or even addition by subtraction. They consider the personal impact on a player, but they also know that the business insists that they must follow their objectives and mission. And in that commitment comes the impersonal necessity to often look at productivity and potential above the fact that a player is playing down the street from his old high school. This can be hard on a family, hard on your health, but in the end, it's just part of the game, and the game will move on.